Welcome back, everyone. My name is Joan Krusich. I'm a Northern Plains member in Livingston, Montana. We've moved on to our next topic of the summit, the role of power companies in a transition to a clean energy future. We're joined first by our keynote speaker of the summit, John Farrell. John Farrell is a co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and he directs the Energy Democracy Initiative. Widely known as the guru of distributed energy, he has received accolades for his vivid illustrations of the economic and environmental benefits of local ownership of decentralized renewable energy. He hosts the Local Energy Rules podcast, telling powerful stories of local clean energy action, and frequently discusses the ownership and scale of the energy system on Twitter. We are so thrilled that John could join us.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Joan. I do have some slides and I'm going to try to share my screen here, but while I do so, I just wanted to say how flattered I was to be invited to speak with you. I had the pleasure of being out to give a talk for the Arrow annual meeting 4 years ago in 2017. And while I was out there, I had the chance to take my family on a trip to Yellowstone. We took a little swim in the boiling river and then got to take in the town of Butte for a couple of days around that conference. So it was totally understandable and yet a little bit disappointing that I have to address you today via video camera, where I feel like I spend so much of my time with this backdrop behind me and on a screen with folks, as I'm sure many of you are experiencing as well. But at any rate, thank you again for having me. I'm going to start off actually with a little bit of a song. So the title of my talk here is The Innovative Role of Power Companies, and this idea of sort of taking charge of our energy future. And this song will sort of lead into, or snippet, I should say, will lead into kind of the broader theme. So in the spirit of Bob Dylan, and much poorer than he would have sung it, how many years must a customer wait before she can turn solar on? And the reason I sing this little song is that I've been involved with some proceedings in Minnesota where we have a utility, Xcel Energy, that probably is a lot like Northwestern Energy. And there's a customer who has submitted some comments to the state regulatory body, the Public Utilities Commission, saying that the utility said that she's going to have to wait 15 years to put solar on her rooftop, or 5,475 days. And so I just wanted to flag that in the way that my talk was pitched about the innovative role of power companies, I just then amend it slightly and say the potentially innovative role of power companies, because unfortunately, in a lot of ways, as I'll talk about, there isn't always alignment between the kinds of changes we want to see with the energy system that allow us to capture the economic benefits, to widely disperse the financial opportunities, to widely disperse clean energy, and the interests of the power companies. So I just want to start off by saying, first of all, clean energy innovation is already happening in a lot of exciting ways, and just share a few examples of that before we dive into some of the things that we see as opportunities in terms of the rules for the system and for how utilities can be a part of that. One of them is this map that I just love that we made a few years ago, tracking the solar development in California over a 10-year period. And you can see here on your screen that it's animated because we did a little time lapse of the growth of solar. But what's remarkable is that you go over 10 years in California, customers added almost 6 gigawatts of solar. That adds up to over 10% of the utility company's peak energy demand, or of the entire state's peak energy demand. So all of these customers, and the reason I like to share this one is because most utilities still think about energy decision-making happening from the top down. That they make a plan, they talk with public regulators about a plan, that the energy that we get comes out of those plans. And what customers in California and in Montana and so many other places across the country are saying is, no, we want to have a choice. And we're going to do it for our own reasons. Maybe it's because it saves us money on our bills. Maybe it's because we have a deep commitment to the environment and to solving climate change personally. Maybe it's just because it's convenient at a location that where we live, where it's helpful to have power that can be provided by the sun and stored in a battery. So I just love this example of the fact that a lot of decision-making in the energy system is now happening by actors outside of our traditional structure. Another great example is Ohm Connect. So this is a company, I interviewed their CEO, Cisco DeVries, on our podcast, Local Energy Rules, just in the last year. And they have a new project called Resi Station. It's an ambitious project based on the work that they already do, which is networking together homes and businesses in order to provide power to the power grid. And so in California, which is one of the few states, unfortunately, where the rules allow for this, they're planning to network together enough homes and businesses with solar panels and battery storage and smart thermostats and what have you, all of these innovative kind of cutting edge grid technologies to supply 500 megawatts of networked power that could to respond to the needs of the electricity system. So maybe it's a really hot, sunny summer day and they need more electricity to help meet air conditioning load. Well, these customers have agreed that they'll turn their power down. Maybe a business will cycle their air conditioner off. A homeowner will cycle their air conditioner off and allow for that power to be grouped together with all of their neighbors that have volunteered to do this as well with Ohm Connect, and that power can be bid into the market. Another great example of this is Minnesota's community solar program. So I'm from Minnesota, I live in Minneapolis. We worked hard here to get a legislation passed a number of years ago that would allow for third parties to develop community solar projects. So just for example, you can see here a photo of me standing with Timothy Denherter Thomas. He's the general manager of a group called Cooperative Energy Futures. They're a cooperatively owned community solar developer. And this project that they developed on the roof of the Shiloh Temple, of which there are many stories written because it's a really remarkable project, supplies electricity to the church and also to many of its members who maybe they didn't have enough money to do a solar array on their own home, or maybe it was just that they were looking for a way to make a small investment in reducing their energy bill. But it helps to reduce the energy bills for the church and for its members. It also is located in a fairly impoverished area of Minneapolis. And as part of the development, because it was cooperatively developed, the subscribers had some say in the choices that they made. They also made big attempts to both train and to invest in hiring workers from that community to do that project. And all told, these community solar projects across the Twin Cities metropolitan area and serving folks in the suburbs have produced 800 megawatts of solar energy, enough to serve almost 160,000 homes on an annual basis. And there's 14,000 homes and businesses that are subscribers to these community solar projects. And just to give you a sense of this, because numbers of megawatts and numbers of homes served can sometimes be a little bit obscure, Northwestern Energy, the big investor-owned utility that serves many Montana communities, has a peak energy demand, probably on a hot summer afternoon, of about 1,250 megawatts. Minnesota's community solar projects all cumulatively produce about 800 megawatts, almost 2/3 of that total. And the Resi Station that Ohm Connect is looking to construct in California, again, networking together homes and businesses and their energy production and consumption would be almost 1/3 of that. So it's not only that there are these really interesting ways of generating energy and of aggregating people together that are happening, they can really scale up to create a very significant and meaningful amount of energy production that can contribute to the needs of the grid. The last thing I want to say about the innovation that's happening is just to share this top line from a study that was done by Vibrant Clean Energy. So I spent a lot of my time working with folks deep into the policy business in the analysis of clean energy economics. These folks are pretty much the premier ones in the country right now in analyzing the costs and benefits of using what we like to call distributed energy solutions, like rooftop solar, like battery storage. And they found that if we set a broad goal to reduce carbon emissions and pollution from our grid, to build renewable energy for our communities, that across the whole country, if we had a national goal, we could save $500 billion in reaching that goal if we focused on more local solutions, more things on customer rooftops, more battery storage in our communities, because it would reduce the costs of getting to that ambitious goal by reducing the need for large-scale transmission or utility-scale energy production that might be more expensive. So it was actually more efficient for the grid, more cost-effective for us to reach our clean energy goals, to use these kinds of distributed and democratic energy solutions. So I think we're just at this a remarkable moment in time where the technology and the economics of the kinds of solutions that communities really want to see are very cost-effective, and in fact will make getting to our goals of cleaner energy systems and capturing those jobs and economic benefits even better. But unfortunately, we have a little bit of a structural problem in the sense that the market that we have, the electricity market, isn't necessarily set up in the way that can best capture all of these benefits. And so I want to go back in time a little bit here to talk about how this started. We're now back at the beginning of the 20th century, the early 1900s. We're seeing electricity as a technology just emerging. The first entrepreneurs are building power plants that will serve a few city blocks. They're stringing wires to homes and businesses and trying to sell them on the advantages of electric lighting instead of gas lamps. This is obviously in the wake of the Great Chicago Fire, for example, caused infamously by the knocking over of a gas lamp. So people are thinking of this from a safety perspective, from a convenience perspective. And the problem, of course, is that you've got no regulation over this new industry. And so you've got different companies competing to string wires to the same houses or businesses. You have these entrepreneurs struggling to know, like, can I make profits doing this? Because I don't know if tomorrow somebody else is going to come and undercut me and outbid me. And will I be able to compete in this situation? And you also have customers then who are left not really sure like who they should go with or what to expect in terms of the costs or prices or safety or all of these kinds of things. So one of the industry titans, Samuel Insull, he was Thomas Edison's right-hand man, and a number of other folks who were big in the industry got together and said, you know what? We need to seek a different way here. We think there's actually a win-win. We think that it's going to be better for the economy and for customers if we can have protection from cutthroat competition in a Wild West. And we think it will be better for us, actually, that we'll have a better chance of having steady profits and profitability if we don't have so much competition. And so his innovation and in conversation with state legislatures, there was agreement was, let's create a regulated system of utilities, of utility markets. So in the early 1900s, again, in 1905, approximately, Wisconsin and New York led what then became basically a 50-state phenomenon of creating monopoly electricity markets, where utilities would be given a prescribed geographic area to serve. They would serve the customers in that area, and there would be no competition within that, whether to produce power from a large-scale power plant or a small-scale power plant, or to build power lines and transmission lines. All of that would be controlled and owned by the utilities. So essentially what Samuel Insull's innovation was this idea that you have to be a customer at all times of this utility. You don't have any choices about where you're able to go and get your energy from. Now, to be fair, there have been some structural changes to this in a variety of states. In some cases, they've broken apart some of the different pieces, like high voltage transmission lines, the ones you'll see along the highway, or big power plants, and they've said that the utility now will be focused more on power distribution. But the key is that in general, in most states, that monopoly structure remains. And those utilities still have a lot of power over the market. And they also have, as a result, a lot of political power as well. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So one thing to just note about this monopoly structure is that from the standpoint of getting us affordable, reliable electricity, it worked really well. These utilities, monopoly utilities, freed from the competitive pressures, were able to focus their resources on scaling up the size of power plants to be more economically efficient. The cost of electricity dropped dramatically, and it allowed us to not only use it for lighting, but for all sorts of home appliances, gadgets, industrial motors. Many new uses came about from electricity that were made possible by the fact that these utilities were able to provide it at an ever lower cost as they scaled up. It's important to say that great economic success did come with some costs. Of course, the technologies and the fuels that we use to power the growth of the electricity business were often fossil fueled. They polluted in many ways, both harming the health and well-being in terms of air quality of families and children. They've contributed to the rising global temperatures and the threats from climate change. And of course, all of these impacts disproportionately happened to communities of color, to Black and Brown and Indigenous folks who tended to live closer to the places that were impacted by this development. But writ large, the monopoly model was working in terms of allowing people access to affordable energy. Now, one of the things that ILSR has been focused on, and the work that we do, is this analysis of the economics and the opportunity from different models. And so this chart is taken from something we publish quarterly. It's a quarterly power plant capacity update. So what we're looking at and what you're seeing here, this is actually our annual report. Each bar represents the new power plants that have been constructed by utilities and independent companies in a given year, or by individual homeowners and business owners that put solar on their rooftop. And then the colors on the bars represent the type of technology that was used to supply that new electricity. So you can see that since we started in 2004, way back then in 2004, which only 15 years ago, but in some ways seems a long time ago, over 90% of the electricity being produced, the capacity of new power plants was from fossil fuels, primarily from gas. And even in the subsequent few years, there were new capacity was added from coal plants, and has always been a significant presence of gas plants. But the overall trend here over the last 15, 16 years has been fewer fossil fuels, lots more renewable energy. And then I want to call your attention to the bar right on the top, because that is the most interesting thing, because it is a fundamental shift in how we even think about bringing energy into the energy sector. So the reason we started doing this report in the first place was that before we started doing this, nobody was really paying attention to rooftop solar. We knew people were doing it. We knew people often did it for their own reasons, to save money on their own electric bills, but we never really thought about the systematic impact that it could have. And what we've discovered in that orange bar is that a growing amount, and now consistently between like 15 to 20% of the electricity, new power plant capacity that's added in any given year comes from small scale solar. It's on rooftops of businesses and homes. It might be the community solar projects that I was referencing in Minnesota, but it's stuff that's basically owned by someone other than the utility company, owned by the customers themselves, making their own individual choices. So what this chart represents is not only a radical shift in the technology we use to supply electricity, but also in who's choosing to produce that electricity. That a substantial portion of our electricity, the choices are not being made by the incumbent utilities that have had this monopoly for so many years, but are being made by individual customers. So in a way, we have kind of a mismatch going on in our current moment between the technological opportunity and the choices that people want to make around things like solar and energy storage, and the way that the grid system has been built to operate. So this map of the transmission grid gives you a sense of kind of the spidery network of these transmission lines that connect different states. And if they were on here, you would also see power plants located along these transmission lines, which then run into our cities. So if you look, for example, at Minnesota, you might have to squint a little bit, and I apologize, but the transmission lines kind of are a hub and spoke format around Minneapolis and St. Paul. And they go out into areas further out state where they would connect to power the coal or nuclear or other big power plants that would serve the community. And yet increasingly, we're seeing customers wanting to choose to produce electricity themselves. In fact, two of the photos here are actually from houses in my neighborhood in Minneapolis, where folks have chosen to put solar on them. Another mismatch that we have to kind of think about too is in the way that utilities have been profiting from the decisions that they make on our energy system. So if you look back to about the 1980s, early 1980s, the return on investment for someone who put their money into utility stock versus like a US Treasury or a corporate bond was about the same. There was a couple percentage point difference, but it was largely similar. And what you can see in these two thick lines is a divergence, that even though monopoly utilities tend to be fairly low risk investments, after all, they have captive customers, so they're not competing, and utility commissions tend to defer to them and to allow them to recover the revenue for the things that they invest money on, whether it's new power plants or power lines or what have you. You can get a lot more money investing in a low risk utility as a shareholder than you can in a lot of other low risk investments like US Treasuries. And so we have this interesting situation happening where utilities are still profiting very significantly from investing in infrastructure in the way they traditionally have and in the way that we reward them to do. So they spend $1 billion on a power plant, and as this chart indicates, they might get an 8% return on that. That's $80 million for the utility shareholder on that investment. So we do have this tension in terms of the kinds of investments, the kinds of development, the kinds of technology that are available to customers, and the way the utilities still think about the energy system. So I want to ask a question that kind of sets up this premise a little bit more in real terms about who makes decisions and who will innovate in the power sector for in our energy system in the coming years. So assuming that most of you have a smartphone, and maybe it's an iPhone or a Samsung or an LG, some other device like that. My question to you is, did you get the smartphone that you own? Is the brand on that smartphone from your landline phone company? And I'm just going to ask you to quickly go to the chat if you can, and I'll probably have to minimize my screen so I can see the chat here. But I'm just curious, let me know, yes or no. Did you get your device from the landline phone company, or did you get it from someone else? Let's see if I can get my way to the chat here. Let's see. Here we go. All right, a lot of people. Yeah, I'm laughing at CenturyLink too. It's to my disappointment that our company still has to work with them for our phone service. All right, please feel free to stay active in the chat if you like, but clearly most people are not getting their device from the landline phone company. And what we're really talking here is disruption, obviously. So, you know, when the technology was available to create mobile phone devices, landline phone companies were not thinking of how to seize on that opportunity and make money from it. They were thinking about how do we preserve the business model that we have of steady revenue from people who are customers, you know, or maybe they're long distance customers, maybe they're signing up for voicemail, that kind of stuff. They're signing up for caller ID, not thinking about what the possibilities were for this technology. You know, they were very comfortable in their monopoly business model, which is sort of both a fact of their market structure and also just a behavioral trait and a cultural trait of not having competition to push them. So as Abraham Lincoln famously once said, monopolies don't really innovate. And just another way to put a gloss on this is if you asked a child of this age what this device is in the top right, most of them probably would have no idea what that is. They might have seen a picture of it somewhere. I certainly remember growing up with a couple of those in my house because my parents were too cheap to want to pay for touch-tone dialing. But the idea here is that the technology disruption that happened not only is happening from the outside, but also happened much more quickly than these companies were prepared to adapt to. Now, some of them have, and in fact, you see some of the same names that were on those landline monopolies now on your cell phone bill. And as a result, the United States still has some of the highest cell phone bills in the developed world. If you want to read more about that, in part because of the fact that we have such a concentration of market players in that business. But we're going to move on from that and stick to the electricity sector here. I also just want to say that Abraham Lincoln didn't in fact say anything about monopolies innovating, but I did really enjoy seeing this quote on the internet and thought it would be fun to play around with it. But he should have said it, and he might have come around to that as he saw the concentration of industry that would happen in the next few decades in the United States. So we have all of this incredible innovation going on in the energy space. Businesses that are capitalizing on the new technologies, customers wanting to exercise their choices, and a utility model that really encourages utilities to think about, not to think about doing things differently, because in fact, the way they make money still relies on them spending money to build things and owning it, and not in rethinking that approach. So how do we rethink it? So I'm going to ask you to go to the chat again. And there are 8 cities in the United States that currently receive 100% of their electricity from renewable resources. And I'm just curious if folks have a sense of, or want to take a guess at, what might these 8 cities have in common? And if you could go into the chat again, I would love to see what ideas that you might have. Liberals, I love that. Hydropower, municipal utilities, a lot of different good options here. Hawaii. Good guesses there. I've done a couple of podcast interviews with folks from Hawaii, the manager of the Kauai Island Electric Cooperative, which is about 80% renewable actually, but not quite. They're more on Democrats, municipalized utilities, no monopoly utility. Hydro again. Okay, excellent. CCAs. Ooh, points to Maggie from Northern Plains Resource Council. You're on the subject here. So this map was produced in a report we actually did on community choice, which is a policy that allows cities to, on behalf of their customers, choose where their electricity comes from. So the states you see shaded in blue have this policy. And what I like to call it is municipalization light. So instead of a city actually like taking over a utility and all of the infrastructure that goes along with it, the poles and wires and whatnot, community choice says you can choose where the power supply comes from. So if Helena, Montana or Billings were in a state that allowed for community choice, the city council could have a vote saying, okay, we're going to choose the power supplier for our city. We may contract with Northwestern Energy. We might contract with some third party, and we might choose to put out requests for proposal to build new electricity generation in or near our community to serve our customers. And those customers would have a choice. They would say they could either stay with the city's choice for electricity that would probably be a higher percentage of renewable energy, and in most cases that we've seen across the country also cheaper than the incumbent electricity bills, or they would be able to opt out. But the idea is that we allow cities to help drive the interests of their consumers. And where this gets back to my question is that all of the 8 cities that we're talking about that have achieved 100% renewable electricity have some sort of choice. They are either, as some folks mentioned, municipal utilities, where the utility is owned by the city, or they are cities in states that have this community choice option. Now, I'm not going to pretend that it's easy to pass this kind of policy, but I just want to highlight that when we talk about advancing and transforming our energy system, the places that have done it are the ones that are not stuck in a monopoly model that lacks democratic control. So it has been places where the residents and businesses and the community members are able to have a say in where their energy comes from. Fortunately, there are some other interesting examples that I wanted to share with you that I think give us some hope that we don't have to completely rewrite the market rules, even if we should, to make change happen. So this was from an interview that I did with Mayor Mark Gamba from Milwaukee, Oregon. It's about 20 minutes south and east of Portland, so a relatively small suburb. And they have made like over 150 other cities in the United States a commitment to 100% renewable electricity, and are struggling, like a lot of these cities are, with how do we do that when we have a utility company, Portland Gas and Electric, that has a monopoly. And so they started off, as many cities do, they took their city hall and made it solar powered and put solar on the roof. They ran Solarize campaigns like you see in some of your own communities in Montana, asking people to band together and go solar at the same time. They've done advocacy at the state legislature and said, hey, can we have some more power in the city to decide the energy future of our community with something like a stretch energy code? There are a number of states that have these, and the basic idea is most states set the building energy code for a community, the entire state. So there's a one state standard. Some states have created a 2-tier standard with what's called a stretch or a reach code, and allows there to be some standardization in the building energy code to help the business community understand like what the standard is. But that reach code will allow communities to ask for things like being solar ready, or having buildings ready for electricity only, or just having much more stringent standards for energy efficiency to make it easier to meet clean energy goals, but also, of course, to save money on the energy bills for all of their consumers. But the last and most interesting thing that Mayor Gamba talked about in our conversation was that this community choice model usually has come about in states where the legislature passes a bill essentially like breaking up the monopoly of the utility, or it is passed in states where they've already restructured and customers already had some choice in their utility. But in this case, they went and sat down with Portland General Electric and said, look, we want to be able to achieve our 100% renewable electricity goal. You provide electricity. You have these ways for individuals to sign up to get power from wind or power from solar. Why don't you let us do that for our entire city, like we would do if we had community choice, but we'll do it with the incumbent utility. And that it's not a done deal yet, and it's something they're still working on, but Portland General Electric is working with them on, can we build a model where we come up with a way that a city can choose its electricity supply? So if they want to be renewable, they can, and the incumbent utility will supply it for them and come up with a reasonable price for that power. It's also happening in Utah under a similar model. So legislation was passed a few years ago, not to give cities the unilateral authority to go ahead and choose their electricity supply, but to form a partnership with other cities to do this, what they're calling 100% net renewable electricity purchase from Rocky Mountain Power, the incumbent electric utility. So again, not tossing out the entire system, but saying, are there ways that we can move toward what communities are looking for within the system that we already have? And the communities that have signed up to do this constitute a third of Utah's population, including Salt Lake County, which included Salt Lake City, many of its suburbs, and a number of other communities across the state. So it's a really remarkable way that folks have figured out to approach this that says, can we work with the utility? Is there a model that allows us to do this with the utility and not just having to go it alone or be at odds with them? I wanted to give a couple of other examples as well. Most of the time here, I've been talking about models that apply to investor-owned utilities, like the community choice model, or we talked about municipal and community choice within that broader perspective of what communities have reached 100% renewable. But there are also a lot of communities served by rural electric cooperatives, both in Minnesota and Montana, and many places across the country. About 1 in 7 electric customers is served by a cooperative. And these cooperatives are owned by their members. So much like a municipal utility, the members are also owners of the co-op. And I have to take about 30 seconds here to describe this issue that went on in Colorado to give you a sense of the structure. But the way that cooperatives work is they don't all generate the power themselves. They did back in the days when they were first created back in the 1930s and 40s, but they quickly realized that in order to provide competitive electricity prices, they needed to do something a lot like the for-profit utilities and build bigger power plants. So they banded together to do that, and they often signed very long-term contracts to do so. So Tri-State is an example of one of those groups of banding together co-ops. It mostly serves cooperatives in Colorado and New Mexico and some other places in the Mountain West. And they ran into a problem in recent years, which is the huge commitments that they had made on very long-term contracts to coal power plants were more expensive than power that you could buy on the open market, and were much dirtier than many of the cooperatives and their members wanted to buy. And they also had very stringent rules restricting how much power cooperatives could produce for themselves. So what we've seen happen in the last couple of years is a couple of co-ops in particular have broken away from Tri-State and said, we're going to go back to being more self-reliant and making our own decisions. So I spoke with General Manager Luis Reyes from the Kit Carson Electric Cooperative a couple of years ago. This image here is actually from their website just a couple of days ago. But by the end of the year, 100% of the electricity from this, for the daytime load for this cooperative is going to be supplied by solar projects that are fairly small, about 2 megawatts apiece, built and scattered all over the utility service territory, the cooperative service territory. So they're providing jobs and economic benefits to communities across the area that the cooperative serves. They're meeting a huge amount of their electricity needs during daytime hours, and they're doing it at a really competitive price compared to what they would have been able to get under Tri-State. So it's been a really interesting way that we're seeing these cooperatives kind of rediscover their sense of self-reliance, and in a way that's really beneficial to their members. Another one is the Delta Montrose Electric Association, also in Colorado. They were aiming for 20% local renewable energy production. Tri-State told them 5% is your limit. You can't do anything more by yourselves. I had a really interesting interview with former board member Ed Marston a few years ago where we talked about the straitjacket that it felt like they were in. This is before they were able to successfully break away. Ed unfortunately passed away just last year. But he was prescient in the fact that this cooperative eventually moved to break that relationship with Tri-State. And in the deal that they have gotten with their new energy provider, they are going to reach that goal of 20% local renewable energy production within the next 12 to 18 months. So it's pretty remarkable. I'm sorry, I just popped the chat open by accident there. So I want to talk a little bit about the structural choice that we have in energy democracy. So we've covered a lot of the innovation that's out there, the limits of the structure we have, some of the cool ways that we're innovating within those structures, the way that cooperatives are able to exercise a little bit of their democracy muscles, the way that communities have been able to create structure within the monopoly to work with utilities around some of their clean energy goals. But I want to highlight this structural issue in general with a metaphor that I think might be helpful in terms of understanding it. So you see the map before. It's the U.S. Transmission grid. So it's the high voltage transmission lines that run along the highways that move power longer distances. And on the right-hand side, you have the interstate highway system. In fact, there's actually a lot of overlap because we often decide that it's easier to site power lines that people often don't like to have to see next to roads that people also aren't big fans of looking at. But these two networks, while they are similar in terms of their breadth and in terms of their structure, they're very different in the sense that one is privately owned and the other one is publicly owned. And where that really matters in terms of the way that we're making decisions in the energy system is this idea of open access. So on that interstate highway network, as well as the local and county roads and city roads, we have open access. If you want to provide services using those public sources of transportation, those publicly funded sources of transportation, you can do that. And so we have robust competition, for example, in package delivery. The Postal Service, UPS, DHL, FedEx, they can all use that open access network to provide services. The electricity grid is completely different. On the transmission system, so the picture I showed you, there are some rules, but from the federal government that require non-discriminatory access to the system. But ironically, we do not provide that same open access at the distribution level. So those poles and wires that run down our streets and alleys, you can't get onto those unless the monopoly utility expressly gives you permission or unless we have policies that allow for it. And the problem is that as we've probably feels like I've been harping on it by this point in my presentation, we have a lot of different choices. We need more options. We need more ways that we can exercise the choice that we have from the technologies that are available, whether that's putting solar on our own roof and being able to get fair compensation for it, a fight that I'm sure folks at Northern Plains and many of you are familiar with, as it looks like from your recent legislative session, to be able to do energy storage, maybe even to be able to network with your neighbors and to put together the power from your solar arrays and sell that into the grid system, to allow third parties like Ohm Connect to come in and participate in the market and to provide the needs of the energy system. And frankly, to see if they can do it more cost effectively than the incumbent utility. Because as I mentioned before, they get a pretty generous rate of return for a fairly low risk business. There's a lot of folks who would like to come in and offer services that might be able to beat that price. And we need to think about how we can offer that. So I always like to offer a little bit about what you can do about this. You're looking at this, you're not an energy wonk spending 40 hours a week looking at spreadsheets and looking at energy costs or working on model legislation. What are some of the things that you can do in order to help change the way that we approach the energy system in order for your community to have more choice over its energy future? So I'll just offer one thing is you can hear some more stories about stuff that's working. I've got over 139 episodes of our Local Energy Rules podcast. We just released one about a Colorado law that creates more transparency at rural electric cooperatives, for example, trying to make it easier for members to have more of a say. And it's the kinds of thing that has led to the changes that we're seeing at those. Had a great interview with advocates here in Montana about the coalition of cities that are setting exciting renewable energy goals. And we even got one from Hawaii, for example, that I did earlier this year about rules that have changed there at the state level to make sure that utility profits actually depend on their performance on a number of metrics that are important to us, like the energy affordability, clean energy, access to customers to produce their own energy, all of these kinds of things that are so different from the way that we normally provide profit to utilities by just saying, 10% of whatever you spend on something, you'll get back as profits for your shareholders. So it's a lot of different things that you can learn about. Some of them are more on the policy side, can get a little wonky. Others are really focused on the stories and on the opportunities at the local level. During a Solarize campaign, I was just on the Northern Plains website checking out some of the great ways that they're organizing people together. But not only can you help your own energy bill by getting solar and reducing your energy bill, by banding together with lots of other people, you get folks really interested in preserving the rights of folks to go solar and the ability of people to make their own choices. So it's helping build that constituency for changing the rules to make it possible for more people to do that. It sounds like Northern Plains does a great job of organizing folks to show up at the Capitol and to work on energy and energy democracy policy. Get out there, join up with them, and help to advocate together for how you can change the system to work better for everyone. And then the last one is if you happen to be in territory served by a rural electric cooperative, run for the board. These board seats are generally open to everybody. Northern Plains actually published a really great scorecard a few years ago about how easy or hard it might be to do this in your co-op territory. So maybe the first thing you do is look at, are the rules fairly open for people to get onto their cooperative board and to help change the decisions that the cooperative makes about where your energy comes from. So I just want to wrap up by saying utilities really can innovate. There are some great examples. We're seeing that in some states like Utah and Oregon, out in Vermont, Green Mountain Power, for example. But there are also a lot of others in this space who are innovating and often doing it better and more effectively. And we need to change the market rules and change the system in order to make sure that people have the choices to use those better options. Market rules, the traditions of the utilities and the way that they've acted, the conservative culture of being a monopoly, and the political power that utilities have, as I'm sure you're very aware of, can make it hard to change the rules. But we have to put up that fight. We have to point out that it shouldn't be up to a company that got a monopoly 100 years ago for one reason, which is building out a grid efficiently, ought not necessarily to be able to keep it in the 21st century when the system and the opportunities of the system are much different. And the last thing is just say there are really good stories of success out here. If you look around, whether it's from our podcast or other places, don't give up. There are so many places that are fighting this same fight to find innovation, to find ways to transform their energy system. Maybe some of the ones that I've talked about today are not the right ones for Montana, but maybe you'll find ones that are, and other people have tried them too. So stick with it. I just want to say thanks so much for inviting me. I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person, but it was very much my pleasure, and I look forward to having some conversation and answering some questions.
Great, thank you, John. Thanks so much. I know that people are going to be very energized with some questions here. I'm Ed Ulick, and the chair of the Northern Plains Clean Energy Task Force, and I have a question that, so actually this question is probably addressed to myself, but maybe John as well. I think actually, John, you're going to be the first to take a crack at this. Given Montana's current laws regulating renewables, is it possible for us to do any of the great things Mr. Farrell says other states are doing to allow customers choice or allow groups to do solar projects, et cetera?
So I guess I have two answers for you. Within any structure in any state, yes, there are things that you can do. So I'll just give a few examples. One that I actually didn't talk about, but I think I talked about when I was out there 4 years ago in the presentation I gave, is every city in every state, for the most part, retains the legal authority to take over their electricity grid and to municipalize. And what we've learned in the studying that I've done of this idea over the past decade is that most cities never get there. They might do a study of the feasibility. They might have a ballot initiative about it. They might spend a long time arguing with the utility about it. But what they do get is leverage. It is really the only meaningful stick that a city has in its arsenal to battle with the incumbent utility. And so starting that conversation by saying, actually, we think that the choices you make are bad and that we could make better ones, engages the conversation in a completely different way. And it actually gets to one of the other questions I see about this idea about paying more for clean energy, right? What we've consistently seen in studies that communities have done about municipalization is that they find that they can generally get more clean energy than the utility is currently giving them and have lower bills together if they had a municipal utility. And part of that has to do with the fact that clean energy is just getting so cheap. So it's market driven. And part of that has to do with the fact that unlike a utility, a city is not trying to make a profit off the electricity that it sells. So that utility profit margin, like I said, 8%, 10%, sometimes even a little bit higher. When a municipal utility borrows money to build infrastructure, it can do it at like 3% or 4%. And the difference in that overhead is a lot of savings that communities ought to be talking about. And so maybe again, your community, maybe Helena, Montana says we should talk about municipalization and never takes over the utility. That's fine, but it totally reframes the conversation for people to understand that the utility has a monopoly because we gave it to them. And that franchise is supposed to be a public trust to provide us with what our communities want. And if they're not doing that, it can be revoked. And we should be asking tough questions about whether or not we are getting what we ought to give, given that we are a market economy. Having a monopoly is kind of anathema. We don't do it very often, but we've given it in this unique case. And so we have to always be asking ourselves the hard question of, is this monopoly still the right thing? Is it okay to continue to have an exception to the way we do things for electricity to allow a private company to have a publicly sanctioned monopoly? Is I think the kind of question we need to always be asking.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, are waking up to the fact that they're really frustrated. The decisions about what kind of power they have and what the implications of that power are made in a corporate boardroom, that they don't have any choice about that. And so that they're frustrated with that. So maybe you have the map that's showing the different community choice aggregation communities. Could you just discuss a little bit more about that as we have some other questions coming in?
Yeah, so I really do want to emphasize that community choice. So the only state that has passed a community choice aggregation law that had not already restructured the market to allow for retail electricity choice is California. And in that case, they had re-regulated after having retail choice. The reason this is important is that in a state where they've already restructured, so where I already can pick my electric utility, there's not this behemoth utility company that has a monopoly ready to take the political fight to you when you go to the legislature and say, we want choices. Instead, in those states, customers already had choices, and this was just a different way of aggregating customers to have choices. So the political lift in a state like Montana or Minnesota or Iowa is going to be very different than for most of the states that have passed this, in the sense that the utility will very rightly look at it and say, this is taking everything away from us. And it's probably true. I mean, if you look at California, honestly, probably more than 50% of California electricity customers are going to be served by a community choice agency instead of the utility, because they've rightly recognized it's a better deal on all sorts of different fronts. So the utility will look at that as an existential threat. And that's why I think the Milwaukee, Oregon model or the Utah model are probably more likely in states that are currently monopolies, where you got to have that conversation with the utility and say, look, you're not meeting our needs. We're not going to try to blow everything up, in part because we understand that that's going to be difficult to have that political fight. Maybe you campaign on having that specific fight, and then the fallback is to say, okay, but what can you offer us? Because we want this. And the communities that maybe have set renewable energy goals represent a significant portion of your energy sales. What can you offer us? What's the deal that you can provide? And I think pointing at these other states and saying, hey, Rocky Mountain Power is willing to talk about this with their communities. Portland Gas and Electric is willing to talk about that. Make us a deal. Let's talk about it.
So perhaps, yeah, CCA maybe just too big a lift, and maybe better to work with in communities, as you said, different models. Well, actually, someone had asked me want to know a little bit more about the Utah model. I'd love to know your take on the Utah model and similar models. I thought it was a creative way to approach the issue, and also have some concern that it may not result in replacing fossil fuels with renewables on the grid and addressing climate change at the level that other models might. Do you expect that it will, in fact, dramatically increase renewables and decrease fossil fuels, or will it mostly result in electron shifting so that some communities in the state get the dirty electricity and some get clean? And that also apply to Montana as well, I guess. So.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the specifics of the Utah policy. And as I mentioned about the one in Portland, they were still negotiating it. I think that's a very real concern about, as some people call it, additionality in renewables, is making sure that when we set policy to encourage the development of renewable energy, that it is not just, shifting things around and behind the scenes. So I think that would be part of the negotiations, frankly, is to say, hey, Helena and Billings and Butte, we're going to group together all of our customers for you. It's, 15 or 20% of your electricity sales. You give us a product that's 100% renewable, but we need it to only be new stuff, or we need it to be at least 50% new stuff, so that you can't do that kind of shifting around. And frankly, it ought to be really inexpensive to do that. The new renewable stuff is the cheapest stuff. The older renewables that we got online when we were sort of developing the market and the business model and learning about it were the expensive ones. And I can wax eloquent in California about how they're actually dealing with that tension between the community choice agencies and the incumbent utilities, who bought a lot of more expensive renewables at a time when they were required to by the state, and those contracts, have slightly inflated the price of the power that they provide. But these days, it's generally going to be cheaper for them to do more investment in renewables. What we're finding, Union of Concerned Scientists, Sierra Club, and others have done some modeling. It shows that most of the coal plants in the United States and other large-scale power plants are underwater compared to market prices. And in fact, they only keep producing electricity and stay on the market in states like Montana and Minnesota because the utility gets to choose if they want to schedule them into the market or not. And it costs more, and it's costing customers more today to keep running those plants. So the more pressure we can exert on utilities to change, the better. And definitely asking for more renewables is better because it's also a consumer protection. We're going to get cheaper electricity if we can get it from renewables.
Great. Do you have any thoughts on how best to approach building power or momentum, people power, or momentum for statewide policy to enable CCAs in a state with a hostile legislature?
Yeah, well, to start with, the trick is to figure out what is the interest of those members of the legislature. If it is having campaign money from Northwestern Energy, then I'd say start like they did in Virginia with a ballot pledge that asks legislators not to take money from Northwestern Energy because it's kind of crazy, for example, that we allow utilities that are regulated by legislatures pay them to get elected with a monopoly. So there are big companies out there like Walmart, for example, and they give money to state legislators or to federal legislators. But I always have a choice in shopping around with my dollars to say, okay, well, I don't want to shop at Walmart because they give money to politicians I don't like, or I don't want to shop at Target because they do the same thing, right? I have a choice. I can't choose when it comes to who I give my electric dollars to. And so I think there's a very real argument to be had. And in fact, after the Supreme Court made its Janus decision about saying that a public union member shouldn't have to give their money to a cause they don't want, there's a free speech argument here to say utility companies should not be able to make political contributions because they are taking money from all their customers, and it's compelled speech. I am now, by virtue of being a Northwestern Energy customer, having to make a contribution to a legislator that I disagree with. And also on the flip side, legislators should not be taking money from folks that they regulate, especially ones in a non-competitive market. So the only way the market will change for Northwestern Energy is if the legislature does it or the Public Utilities Commission does it. So I think that's a good place to start because it really, again, puts the microscope on what's the problem here in terms of how we do energy decision-making and where are the conflicts of interest. And then the second thing I think to get people's eyeballs on is this question of, okay, as happened in Virginia with this pledge, now legislators are a little more open to discussing how we change the system because they're not financially tied up with Northwestern Energy. Now it's time to start talking about this issue of what is the monopoly doing and what costs does it have for all of us with the business decisions that they make, for example. That gets a little bit more complicated, but suffice to say that is the way I have found to talk about this that appeals to folks across the political spectrum. That if we talk about it from a monopoly perspective, if we talk about the fact that folks don't have choices, that is compelling speech, it becomes a much different argument than one of, hey, we want renewable energy and they don't want renewable energy. Then it feels like an environmental argument where there's a much bigger wedge between the parties.
Yeah. Oh, good. Next starts with a comment and then on to the question. Thank you, John. So fascinating. We are facing the proposal of 8 new methane generating stations to meet Northwestern's future energy demands. Do you see that stemming from them also having that graph you showed at the beginning of your presentation? If I understand your chart right, they will get greater returns from building new infrastructure and charging us than really doing anything else.
Yes, absolutely. So every utility, and like Northwestern and in most states like that, with the exception of Hawaii, which I mentioned, generally speaking, makes their money when they build something. So it's called what is it called? I'm not going to think of the name. Cost plus or something like that. Anyway, the basic system that we set up 100 years ago was we needed to build a lot of infrastructure. We didn't have a grid. And so we said to the utility, for every dollar you spend, we'll give 10% to your shareholders as a way to incent the market to give money to the utilities. So to get people to buy utility stock, to loan money to the utilities. And we'll guarantee that return through the Public Utilities Commission. So we got lots of capital attracted into it. And you know, the electric grid is rightly called one of the engineering marvels of the 20th century as a result of that. We haven't fundamentally changed the incentives for utilities in 100 years. So they absolutely, anytime you come up with, you know, what is that saying? Like if you have a hammer, every solution looks like a nail, right? Like every problem that you bring to the utility is going to be one that they'll try to solve with building something that gets them a return on equity. But it makes sense. That's their structure. And that's actually, you know, if I was to want to talk to legislators about the problem that we're facing, once I've gotten them to stop taking money from the utility, it's to say, look, the issue here is that the utility has an interest in doing this, and it's our fault because it's how we've agreed to pay them. And you, the legislature or the Public Utilities Commission, are the only ones that can change that. And so if we want to see something different happen, then you're going to need to do something different in how we reward them. So you're absolutely right about these methane generating stations. They are wanting to build them because they're going to make a profit on them. And also the secondary problem in Montana and most other states is that they're going to pass through all the fuel costs to you unhindered. I've been working on that with a number of other advocates as well. There are some states, I believe like Utah and Washington and others, where utilities are actually on the hook for some of the fuel costs, which changes their calculus a little bit in building new gas plants. But in most states, they just get to pass through the costs. So you're probably not following this, but gas costs, methane costs have actually been rising very significantly in the past few weeks. It could be a temporary spike. It might be a new like plateau in gas prices. And it could fundamentally change whether or not these plants are a good deal for customers or not. And I think that's the really important thing to look at. And the way I always try to contextualize this for folks is it's not about whether or not this price is going to be high forever or not. The problem is that we don't know. A year ago, nobody could have told you what the gas price would be today. And 5 years from now, we have no idea. So when the utility tells you this is what they think it's going to cost, they have no idea. And since they have no skin in the game, they don't care either.
Yeah, so we have a utility business model that is partially enshrined in statute, right? We have, this is how we, does decoupling change that arrangement, anything where decoupling whereby the, well, actually you'd be able to explain it, have a better definition than I do. So if you could define decoupling and then
yeah.
see the answer.
So decoupling was tried in a few places to see if you could get the utility to be more willing to allow for energy efficiency. Because the idea was, oh, they don't want to invest in energy efficiency because then they have fewer sales. And if they lose sales, they're going to lose revenue and they're going to lose profits. So they're not going to be interested in it. So the idea behind decoupling was, okay, well, let's decouple, let's detach energy sales from your profits. The problem with it is it still doesn't change that fundamental thing of I build infrastructure, I make money, and energy efficiency does not require infrastructure building. In fact, it's the opposite. You're saying people will save money, so we need to build fewer things. So decoupling really isn't much of a solution. All it does is says to the utility, you don't have to worry about energy sales. We're going to make sure you're profitable no matter what. But it doesn't change their incentive to invest in energy efficiency unless we change how they get paid. So you could say, hey, now you get an 8% return on equity, but we'll give you 10% if you hit a certain target for energy efficiency. Then you're going to see them pour money into it. It's also going to cost us all more, right? Like we're bribing them essentially to do the right thing. And that's one of the things that's problematic about the model that we have is that this is why Hawaii was so useful in terms of like a complete reset. So they don't have like a default return on equity necessarily anymore. They have ways that the like thresholds and targets the utility has to get to earn it. And some of those are based on some historical performance, but they like ratchet up over time. So maybe what you'd say is to the utility, right now, now you make 8%. We're going to give you 6% from now on, unless you ratchet up energy efficiency. But if you do, we'll get you back to 8. And if you go even further than we think you can, like 2 or 3 or 4% savings per year, we'll give you 10%. So we really do. We have to completely rethink the way that we provide incentives to utilities because they're going to keep acting the way that we'd expect them to act when we've got the incentives structured the way they are.
We got time for one really quick last question here. I totally get the cost plus incentive to build plants. Can you explain why building solar or wind facilities aren't as profitable to them? Is the bottom line less maintenance, or is it, as you're now saying, the ability to harness or maybe manipulate more profit from fuel costs?
So this is a great question, and it's a little bit complicated, but I'll try to give the short answer to it. So one issue here is just tradition. So the engineers that work at the utility look at wind and solar and they say, they're variable, we can't count on them. So I'm sure Montana's Northwestern Energy, as like many utilities, justifies the gas plants as firm power, as in we can count on it. Now, just real quick on that, if you look at Texas in February this year, gas is not firm power either, any more so than you can count on any other kind of power plant. All power plants have vulnerabilities. What firms up your grid is the mix of resources. There's a great interview I did with David Bissell from the Kauai Island Utility Cooperative, the podcast, and he talks about this because they're like 70% renewable. And I asked him, like, what about reliability? And he said, it's not about one plant individually, it's about the whole system. So part of the problem is that utility engineers don't think about it systematically, and utilities love to just take whatever they can about reliability and use that to justify things that aren't about reliability, because it's like their primary fallback on, you probably don't understand the engineering stuff, but we sure do. So there's a little bit of that happening. The second thing is that, and this actually gets into the political power issue, most utility workforces, or a lot of them, are unionized. And those unions represent specific trades like pipe fitting. And those pipe fitters they don't hire people in the pipe fitting trades and in the pipe fitting unions don't do solar and wind facilities. They do other things. And in fact, a lot of the solar and wind contractors don't necessarily have a unionized workforce. So there's actually a really interesting intersection here where utilities take advantage of the fact that unions, which of course often align with Democrats, don't like necessarily renewable energy as much as they like fossil fuel stuff, because it won't mean the same members from the same unions get hired to do that work. Even if the utility will still make a profit, the utility relies on that political connection with the union often to have influence at the legislature, especially because unions often have influence with Democrats in the way that utility as a business could have influence with Republicans. So it's a political thing as well. And that's really driving it. So one is tradition, one is the political and the union thing. There's probably at least one other thing, but I don't want to go on too on in that answer.
Yeah, okay, well, very good. We need to take a break now, but John, this has been great. And John will be joining us back again at 1:15. We'll have an introduction of our panel on Montana's utilities and clean energy future that Northern Plains member Julie Holzer will kick off. But John, it's been great, and we'll look forward to seeing you after lunch.